and I'll share the screen, and we're ready to get started. Give me a moment. Let's do that, and let's do this. That and share. Hi, Dennis. Welcome. Dennis's sound is working yet. Okay, but we'll get started up. Can you see the screen? Beautiful. So we're moving on to a new category, as it were, of damage caused by an animal. Up until this point, we spoke about the damage being monetary damage. We're now going to talk about what happens if your animal, in this case, caused the death. Okay, so halacha begins first. Halacha in chapter 10. Whenever an ox kills a Jew, we'll see in a moment, and we've kind of referenced this idea previously. Why that emphasis? Now, and here's the thing: whether it's an adult or a child, whether it's a servant or a free man, whether the ox is a tam or a muad, so we're not concerned about the status of the ox. The ox must be stoned to death. So if an animal kills a human being, a Jew, and whether they, as we've listed over there, they must be stoned to death. The animal is put to death. If an ox kills a Gentile, it is not executed, for this is their law. This is a concept that we've raised before, that we're not required to behave differently with the Gentiles than they would with each other or they would with us. In other words, if their animal were to kill another person, it would not be expected for their animal to be killed. Therefore, if our animal killed them, it would not be expected for us to kill our animal. It's basically saying that in that instance, the law would follow what's their common practice. Halacha 2. Not only an ox, but any other animal, a beast or fowl that kills a human being should be stoned to death. What is the difference between an ox? Okay, so basically that's the rule. The ox, as we've had in many areas of halacha, will deal with what the common example is, but it's not limited to that example. It could be any animal of yours, domesticated or otherwise, that kills, that animal must be put to death. So what then is the difference between an ox that was a tam that killed? In other words, it does not have any previous violent behavior that could have been expected, or a muad, which is an animal that has displayed certain violent behavior previously. We've said already that the animal itself will get killed. Is there any difference? And the answer is there is a difference. In the case where a muad does it, where an animal that was expected, or as we can anticipate because of previous behavior, this type of violence, then the owner of the ox of that tam, so in the case of a tam, the owner is not liable for an atonement fine, but in the case of the owner of an ox that is a muad, is liable for what we call a kapara, which is an atonement fine. Now, the details of what exactly kofer nafsho is, what exactly that atonement fine is the subject, I think it's of the following chapter, but it's in the coming chapters. We'll discuss exactly when and how much is that fine will be and how it's paid and so on. But that would be the primary difference. A time you're not to be expected to pay an atonement fine or an atonement payment. For a muad, you would be expected to pay that. Okay, now since every animal, beast or fowl that kills a human being should be stoned to death, how is it possible to find an animal that is a muad to kill? Right, that should have been the obvious question in the previous halacha. Because if, sorry. Yeah, right. We emphasize, right? The end is if it's a muad, then you got to pay atonement. But a muad means that the animal has been forewarned for this type of behavior. But if as soon as an animal kills a human being, that animal is put to death, how do you ever have a muad? A muad must be that it was warned 3 times. Okay, so the Rambam is going to give us a number of scenarios of how this can come about. Okay, so it says the first example would be if it had killed 3 Gentiles. As we learned, that this halacha applies just to the killing of a Jew where an animal would be killed, but not if it killed a Gentile. Again, because that's not expected within the context of their laws. So, but if the 4th time they then killed a Jew, so it's considered muad, and this time, in addition to killing the animal, the owner would have to pay this kapara, this atonement fine. Another example would be for an ox that is muad to a Gentile. Sorry, emphasizes this point, for an ox that is muad to kill a Gentile is also muad for a Jew. Alternatively, it killed 3 Jews who were classified as treifot. There's a concept, right, of a person who's living, but we anticipate their passing. Someone who's terminally ill, God forbid, and is not expected to live out a year. Although the same would apply when you get into the laws of murder and so on and so forth, although you're not allowed to kill someone like that, and if you killed someone who's terminally ill, it's murder, you wouldn't necessarily be subject to the same punishment as if you had killed a healthy person. So here as well, because a human wouldn't get the punishment of death for killing a treifa, someone who's not anticipated to live, so too an animal that kills a human being that was a treifa, a human being that was terminally ill and not expected to live out the year, they would not be stoned for that. So if it kills 3 people who were terminally ill and not anticipated to live the year, and then kills a healthy person, that would be a muad. Similarly, other possible situations are the following. On 3 occasions, it killed a person and then fled, and it was captured on the 4th occasion. Okay? I mean, it's very unusual, but possible. We must say that it was captured because the owners are not obligated to pay an atonement fine unless the ox is executed. Another situation is if it mortally wounded 3 individuals at the same time, and they and the 4th person, the ox gored, all died at that time. So in other words, you didn't have the opportunity to bring the owners to get warned and to execute the cow before all the 3 passed away, and then the 4th. It all happened pretty much in the same episode. That would be another example. A further example would be if it killed 3 animals. Okay, so an animal that kills 3 animals is also considered muad to kill a human being. In all these instances, it is deemed as muad to kill, and the owner is liable to pay an atonement fine. In others, in addition to putting that animal to death, the owner pays the atonement. There's also another instance, if on 3 occasions, one of the oxen belonging to a person killed a human. So up until this point, we're talking about where the ox itself has got a reputation as a muad, and we've given examples, and nonetheless, it wasn't put to death. But here's a different scenario. Let's say a guy owns a bunch of oxen, and we know from within his herd, 1 ox killed one day, then a second, then a third. Now, we don't know if it was the same ox or a different ox, and we can't pinpoint. We know that it came from Chaim Shmerel's farm, but we don't know which animal it was. Now, on the 4th occasion, we see an ox from Chaim Shmerel's farm killing someone, and this one we've caught it. So although we can't be sure whether this ox is the same one that did the previous 3, Chaim Shmerel is considered muad. His ox is now considered muad, and that would be another scenario where he would have to pay the atonement fee besides for having the animal killed. So that's what he's going to say now. On 3 occasions, one of the oxen belonging to a person killed a human. On each of these occasions, the witness recognized the owner but did not recognize the ox. On the 4th occasion, they saw an ox that killed a person and were able to recognize it afterwards. They did not ever know if it's the same ox that had killed the previous 3 people. In this instance, the owner of the ox is liable to pay an atonement fine. The rationale is that since the owner was warned that he had an ox in his herd that had killed people on 3 occasions, he should have guarded all his oxen. Since he did not, he must pay the atonement fine. Okay, sensible. So in other words, the muad, the forewarning, is on the owner over here and applies kind of equally to all his oxen if this episode transpires where the ox kills someone. Halacha 4, the oral tradition interprets the Torah statement, V'gam ba'alav yumas. Now, here's the thing. What is the basis for, we'll learn more about this, but what's the basis of the owner paying an atonement fine? Because if you look at the strict wording of the Torah tells us that when an animal kills somebody, Gam ba'alav yumas, also its owner should be killed. Now, we know, mipi hashmuah, as it says, from the tradition, coming back from Moshe, that this does not mean literal death. This is what he's saying, as implied, but death by hand and not execution by the mortal court. So, and therefore, and that's actually the basis of why you have to pay an atonement for his soul. So if the owner pays an atonement fine for the person killed, he is pardoned. Although the obligation of the atonement fine is for the owner's spiritual pardon, the property of a person who is obligated to pay an atonement fine is forcefully expropriated even against his will. So what you're basically saying is like this. The Torah says, Gam ba'alav yumas, the owners shall be put to death. This is not an instruction to the court. This is an understanding of what we call misa b'dei shamayim. Hashem will make sure this guy gets what they're deserving. Because they're deserving to be killed in the eyes of heaven, that's why they pay their atonement fine. When they do pay that atonement fine, what's the effect of the atonement fine? They get full teshuvah. They're no longer liable in the eyes of heaven. That's the power of the atonement fine, beyond killing the animal, right? So the Rambam is saying an interesting halakha. Although I have to pay that fine only in lieu of a heavenly pardon, still the physical court can expropriate that payment from me. Okay, that's really what halacha Dalet is saying. Halacha Hey, the fifth halacha: when an ox belonging to two partners kills a man, each of the partners must pay an entire atonement fine. For each requires a full measure of atonement. You can't say each pays half. End of the day, it's my cow that killed. I bear the responsibility of a soul, and I need to pay that atonement fine if I to do my teshuvah. Halacha 6: if an ox is owned by a person, the adjudication of the ox must be concluded in its owner's presence. Just as the warning of the ox and all that has to happen in his presence. But now he's going to list a few examples of where there is no owner, and the halacha is going to be nonetheless, the courts will go ahead with executing the ox. So the basic is that if there's an owner, the owner must be there, and it must be done in the presence of the owner. If the ox does not have an owner, for example, a wild ox, or an ox that was consecrated, meaning it was designated to Hekdesh, to the Beit HaMikdash, or an ox that belonged to a convert who died without leaving any heirs, still it should be executed if it killed a human being, and its judgment is concluded despite the fact that it lacks an owner. Similarly, an ox belonging to a woman, a minor, or a guardian, it's also stoned if it kills a human. The guardians are not required to pay the okay, but in that instance, the guardians are not required to pay the atonement fine, for the fine is as implied by its name for the purpose of atonement. Minors, deaf mutes, and mental incompetence are not men of responsibility who require atonement. Who are these guardians? These apotroposin? These are usually court-appointed guardians of people who otherwise can't care for themselves. So they take on certain responsibilities for these individuals. So in this instance, although this ox, that in the example we're talking about, is under guardianship, and you would kill the ox if it did what it did, but the guardian, although they're generally responsible for the person in their care, they wouldn't have to pay an atonement, because the atonement would only apply to the person that it would be relevant to. And in this case, those people that it's relevant to, the technical owners, wouldn't be subject to that death, and therefore no need for that atonement. Halacha 7: when an ox that is a treifa, so we spoke about it, ox that killed the person who's a treifa. What happens if the ox itself, the ox that was goring, was treif? Then the ox is not executed, and we derive this from the pasuk. It says, "And its owner shall also be put to death." What do we derive from this? That kamisas habalim kach misas ashur, that you only kill an animal in the same type of scenario that you would kill a human, right? Since the owner is already considered as if he is dead and need not be put to death by Hashem. In other words, there is no new consequence because of what the animal did on this person, because anyway they terminate. In a case where the owner would have been terminally ill, you wouldn't put in. There would be no judgment on him for death. So to this ox in that situation, if an ox itself is terminally ill, you don't put it to death. You'll let nature take its course. It will be gone within a year. Halacha 8: when a person sets a dog upon a collie. So you got a trained dog and you command your dog, and the dog kills the person. The dog is not stoned to death. The same law applies if he sets another animal or a beast upon him. So if you set an animal on somebody, you bear the responsibility, not your animal. If, however, he sets a snake upon him, this I can't say that I fully understand, but this is principles that are brought up in the Mishnah that the Rambam is articulating. If you set a snake upon someone, even if he actually places the snake's mouth onto the person, you put the fangs on the individual, and you cause the snake to bite, the snake is stoned. We're obviously talking about a venomous snake where the bite kills the person. It's not just a little skin break. The rationale is that the snake releases the lethal venom on its own volition. In other words, you can't, I don't know, again, like I say, I'm not sure of the biology of this. It's not like the dog that you've trained and set on someone to attack them. Seems like the way the halacha understands it is that the snake releases the venom on its own, irrespective of what you did before. And therefore, you're not, the snake itself would be stoned. In other words, it bears some responsibility. For this reason, the person who sets the snake upon a colleague is not liable to be executed by an earthly court, unlike other wild animals, right? Halacha 9. An animal that kills a person is not stoned to death unless it had the intent to kill a person for whom it would be executed. Okay? So if, however, an ox intended to kill an animal, so it was running towards an animal, and then the animal moved, and there was a human being behind the animal, and it killed the human being instead. It intended to kill it. Or another example, there was two people. It was running towards one guy who was a Gentile, and instead he missed that guy and hit the Jew, killed the Jew. Or he intended to gore a stillborn child and instead killed an ordinary child. So what it was aiming for was a already dead but killed a living child. Then the ox is not executed. Okay, because the victim has to be the one that the ox was intending to attack. If the ox was muad, okay, so that's a tam. If the ox is already known to be violent, the owners are liable to pay the atonement fine or the fine paid for killing a servant. This applies even if the ox killed unintentionally. The owners are held responsible because the ox is muad to kill. So even though it won't be stoned, but there's still an atonement that's necessary for the owners. This, by the way, this fine paid for killing a servant will be dealt with in the laws that discuss also the previous idea of atonement paying that we spoke about. But if somebody killed a servant of somebody else's, the setting of the fine is prescribed in a different way than when we're looking for an atonement payment. As I said, those are details that we'll learn going forward. Halacha 10. The owner of an ox is liable to pay an atonement fine in the following instances. An ox was muad to leap on people in pits. I mean, again, very unusual. But this ox would walk around, maybe saw a person in a manhole, it would jump on the person and smother it to death. Okay? Or if it saw a vegetable in a pit, leaped into the pit and fell on a person there and killed him. It was muad to, sorry. What am I missing here? Sorry. The scenario is like this. He was muad for jumping on people in pits. This particular time, he was going into the pit not for the person, but because he saw some vegetables that he wanted to eat. Happens to be that there was a person there and he killed him. Because it was already muad, this is in contrast with the previous halakha that said it's only liable if it killed the intended person, if it went through with the intended act. Here it's doing something that is benign, going to eat some food, but it kills a person because it was previously muad, the owner would still be liable for an atonement payment. Another example where it's not doing what it intended, but nonetheless there would be an atonement payment. If it was muad to rub itself against the walls, right? When we learned about if the animals rub themselves against the wall because they're itchy. Now what happens is it's rubbing itself against the wall and knocks it over, and there's people there. And now it was rubbing itself against the wall for its own benefit, and the wall falls down and it kills the person. So in both these instances, the ox is not liable to be executed because what it was doing was just going for food or taking care of its itch. There was no intention to kill. The owners are nevertheless liable for atonement fine because the ox is muad to leap into pits in the first instance, or in the second instance to knock people with the wall when it rubs against it. How can we know when an animal is rubbing itself against the wall for its own benefit? Maybe it was intending to cause damage. So he says in that scenario, you'd have to see if it continues rubbing itself even after it knocked the wall down and it killed. Because if after the wall knocked down and it killed, it stopped rubbing, then you could say, okay, maybe it was a malicious intent here. But if it's continuing to rub, then you know that it was simply trying to scratch its itch, as it were. And because that was what the animal was doing, and it's normal, and it's no intention to kill, you don't kill the animal, but the owners will be liable for atonement because it is normal, usual behavior, as it were, of the animal. Halacha 11, the owners are not liable to pay the atonement fine unless the animal kills the person outside their property. Okay, so only if my animal is outside of my property do I become liable for that atonement. If I have an animal kills a person in a domain belonging to the owner's of the animal, the owner is not liable for an atonement fine. In other words, if somebody comes into my property, my animal kills it, although the animal is stoned, I don't have to pay an atonement. Because I say, what are you doing with my property? What's implied? He speaks this out. If a person enters a courtyard belonging to a person without the permission of the owner, even if he enters to demand payment for wages or a debt, now the reason the person coming is a justifiable reason, but it was not with the permission of the owners. And then what happens? The ox that belongs to the owner goes ahead, gores him and kills him. The ox is stoned. The owner is ever free from the atonement fine because, as we said, the deceased did not have permission to enter his property without his consent, even if it was for a valid reason. Halacha 12, the owner is not required to pay an atonement fine in the following situations. A person stood at the entrance and called the owner, and the latter said, yes. The guest entered and he was gored by an ox belonging to the owner. The owner is not liable. For yes does not necessarily mean more than, yes, I'm aware you're there and I'll come speak to you. Doesn't mean, yes, please come in, you have permission to enter. Okay, it's a detail on the previous halacha. Halacha 13, when an animal enters a courtyard belonging to another person and kills a child by treading on it as it proceeds, the owner of the animal must pay an atonement fine. And as besides for the animal getting killed. The rationale is that an animal is considered to be muad to tread on things as it proceeds, what we call regel, right? The damage of regel. Thus, one can conclude when an animal that is muad killed. So we're going to wrap up the principles of everything that we've included in the halacha today. So let's read this. When an animal that is muad kills intentionally, it should be stoned, and the owners must pay an atonement fine. If it killed unintentionally, it's not liable to execute it, but the owners must pay the atonement fine. When an animal is a tam, kills unintentionally, right? It's not liable to execute it, nor must the owners pay the atonement fine. There's no expectation, and so on. If it intended to kill, it should be stoned to death. The owners, however, are not liable for an atonement fine or for the fine paid for killing a servant if the victim was a servant. Halacha 14, the final in today's chapter. It appears to me, says the Rambam, that even though, as he just said in the previous halacha, the owner of an ox that is a tam, that killed a servant or a maidservant intentionally, is not liable for the fine of 30 slaim. So we're getting a glimpse into what those payments would be. The fine is 30 slaim, mentioned in the Torah. If it killed a servant or a maidservant unintentionally, the owner must pay half the value of the servant or the maidservant from the body of the ox, as if the ox had killed another ox or donkey belonging to its colleague. So in other words, he's saying, although we don't see this clearly mentioned in the pasuk, the Rambam is saying his sense is that there would be some liability to be paid in that case of unintentional killing by an animal of a servant, just as you would be liable for any damage that a tam causes to another person's property.
Before you go to the questions,
yes,
just a quick question, please. Killing by stoning is quite a horrific death. Why would the ox be needed to be stoned to death? What lesson is that intended to teach to oxen? Why not a quicker form of death? What is the rationale for that?
Good question. It's a good question. I will say one thing, that the way the Torah describes the stoning process, it's not about tens of people standing around pelting someone with small stones. It is designed to be an immediate death. But nonetheless, I hear your question, and I'm not sure. What you're implying is that maybe if that form of execution was used on a human, there's some form of moral, as it were, to be implied. But when it comes to animal, what is there?
Yeah, that's sure. Exactly.
Just off the top of my head, maybe it's because of the association of what we said early on in the chapter today, that it's all measured against the verse that says Gam ba'alav yumas, that also the owners should be killed. So maybe because it makes an association to the life of the human being, we subject it to the same types of execution that a human being would be subjected to. Although, as I'm saying that, I'm not sure that murderers are stoned. That would only make sense if that's the case, but I'm now don't recall if that's the the method of execution. Anyway,
Thanks.
but it's certainly, but even if that's not the direct correlation, it would seem that that might be the basis for it. Some type of correlation between the methods of execution of a human being, because the verse associates the two. I imagine it's got something to do with that. I don't have a better answer, sorry. Okay, good question. Let's go on to the questions. Okay, 1 of 4. In which of the following cases is an ox that killed a person not stoned to death? Okay, if we killed a child, killed a servant, or killed a Gentile, which instance?
Gentile.
A Gentile. And remember, the rationale is simply because we would apply the same, what we would refer to as common law would apply there, not Torah law, because common law would apply in reverse to you if the animal killed you. Or, yeah. Question 2, if an ox killed another animal on 3 occasions, and then it killed a person, does its owner pay an atonement fine for it?
Yeah, I think so.
Correct. The question really is it considered muad? And this was one of the examples where an animal is considered muad. So in addition to the animal being stoned, the owner would pay a kofar, an atonement fine. 3 or 4. When an ox belongs to 2 partners, kills a person, who pays? Each partner pays half. Each partner pays full. Neither partner is obligated to pay.
Each pays full.
Each pays full, right? They both need an atonement for this, their own individual atonement. It's their animal, and they must pay that. 4 or 4. What is the law when an animal belonging to a minor kills a person? So 3 options. The animal is not killed, and they are not required to pay an atonement fine. The animal is not killed, but they are required to pay an atonement fine. The animal is killed, but they are not required to pay an atonement fine.
Number 3.
3.
Yeah, number 3 is correct, because they would not be put to death themselves, so therefore they don't pay an atonement fine, but the animal certainly, as a murdering animal, would be put to death in line with what we've been learning. Okay.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you, Rabbi.
I had to start late. There was an interruption and then another interruption in the middle.
I'm glad you made it. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thanks.
Take care.
And I've got a, you see, I've got a, can you see I've got a split personality?
Yes, I see. I see we got David times 2 this thing. Dennis, Douglas. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.